So the former Secretary of the Treasury, Ken Henry, the architect of the Henry Tax Review, says that there's a looming tax crisis in Australia. I'm joined by Adam Creighton, the economics correspondent for The Australian. Adam, is there a crisis?
Well, there's a crisis to the extent that the tax system's clearly not raising enough money to pay for government spending. That's certainly true, and for the foreseeable future, that's not going to change.
Now, Adam, given the decline in the iron ore price and the impact that's going to have on the budget, some say $10 billion over the next 4 years, and the effect of an ageing population, there really is some urgency for reform here, isn't there?
Well, look, I think there's the concern is ever present, and the fall in the iron ore price is just a reminder of how vulnerable government revenues are. The problem is revenues are kind of unpredictable and very contingent on, in many cases, what happens overseas, whereas your spending is fixed in stone and rising every year at a faster rate than inflation.
And what about broadening the tax base, putting a GST, for instance, on health and food?
Well, yes, I think it should be on the agenda. Famously, of course, the GST was excluded from the terms of reference of the Henry Review, although I'm pretty sure Ken Henry was on the record saying he'd like to see an increase in the rate and perhaps also the base of the GST to help plug this increasingly large gap between expenses and revenue. My personal preference is if they have to raise the GST, it should be a tax swap. They should use the extra money to cut taxes elsewhere so that the overall burden does not increase. But for various reasons, GST is a more efficient way of raising money than, say, income tax or company tax.
So, Adam, what are some of the biggest inefficiencies you see in the tax system?
Number one in my mind is the income tax system, which of course is the biggest tax, that is personal income tax if you like, is hideously complex, and there are far too many rates. And I think that is the number one problem, that basically ordinary people can't predict what tax they're going to be paying, and they don't know in advance because it is just so complicated, and so therefore they don't even think about it. Now that obviously suits the government because they don't want people thinking about how much tax they pay. But anyone who adheres to any sort of liberal principles must really hate that sort of complexity.
What kind of payments should be addressed if we're going to fix this looming structural budget deficit?
Well, the two that spring to mind is firstly the biggest payment of all, the biggest single expense of the federal government is the age pension, and that's growing very rapidly. Of course, we have an ageing population, and part of the problem with that is that the criteria to get on the age pension are extremely loose. Indeed, the principal residence is not even included in the assets test, so you have lots of people who are quite wealthy and they're on the age pension. So I find if you're going to have a principle that the age pension is meant for the poor, then clearly you need to look at that. And then secondly, on the family payment space, we have three or four different payments, and indeed the worst of these is one known as Family Tax Benefit B, which costs about $5 or $6 billion a year. And this is basically an inducement for the second parent, which is normally the mother, to stay at home. And yet we have other payments that are coming on board that are inducing the second parent to go to work. So we essentially have two different government payments that are pulling people's incentives in the opposite direction. So I think it'd be better to really rationalise these and ideally get rid of both of them.
So reform is clearly needed, but is there political consensus to do that?
Well, so far we've seen a very populist opposition in the federal space, and so I imagine if any sensible proposals were made by the government, even proposals that the Labor Party when in government actually supported, I think that the Bill Shorten opposition will oppose those, and so it's going to make it very, very hard for the government to get any changes through, at least certainly until the Senate changes in July. But even then, there'll be a gaggle of independents in the Senate who will make various demands before they pass the government's reforms. So it will be difficult even then to get any serious tax reform. I mean, it really is the most difficult form of federal policy, because for every change you make, there are winners and losers, and politics abhors that arrangement. So,
Adam Creighton, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jackson.